"You're in the wrong hall, darling," one of the lieutenants muttered as I stepped into the Top Gun briefing, "Real aviators only. Secretaries wait outside." The rest snickered. Then the instructor entered, spotted me, and snapped a salute. "Welcome back, Phoenix 1. Their faces drained instantly. Visual. Opening shot. A fighter jet streaking across a vast, blue sky. Cut to a close-up of a determined but weary face, perhaps looking out a cockpit window. I still remember the fire, the screaming alarms, the smoke choking me at 30,000 feet. That day, I wasn't just Commander Elise Rogers. I was Phoenix 1, the pilot who dragged a burning jet home. But you know what truly broke me? It wasn't the near-death experience in the sky. It was the moment a fresh-faced lieutenant, barely out of flight school, looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're in the wrong room, sweetheart." What would you have done then? It was a Tuesday late afternoon. The Nevada sun beat down outside briefing room 7, baking the tarmac white, but inside, the air conditioning hummed, a welcome relief. My flight khakis were regulation crisp, hair pulled back tight, a fresh, nameless uniform, just issued that morning. I walked in, coffee in hand, the kind of strong, black stuff that tastes like years at sea. The room was already buzzing. Young, confident faces, flight suits unzipped just enough to show off t-shirts underneath. All men. They clustered together, talking in that familiar fighter pilot way, hands slicing the air, tracing imaginary maneuvers, voices loud enough to ensure everyone heard how brilliant they were. I recognized them immediately. I'd flown with their type for 15 years. I chose a seat in the back, set my coffee down, opened my tablet. Someone behind me muttered something, followed by low, quick laughter. I didn't turn. There was a time early in my career when I would have. I would have needed to know what they were saying, felt compelled to respond, to defend, to prove myself. But I'd learned. The best response to men who underestimate you? Let them keep doing it. Let them keep underestimating you until the moment it costs them something. The briefing was set for 14:30. At 14:28, a lieutenant, dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, helmet bag slung over his shoulder, walked past my row. He stopped. Backtracked. He looked at me, then at the room number on the wall, then back at me again. "You're in the wrong room, sweetheart," he said. His tone wasn't hostile, not exactly. It was just confidently dismissive. The way you'd redirect a lost tourist. Real pilots only. Secretaries sit outside. The conversations around us died. Heads turned. My blood ran cold, then simmered. I looked up at him, letting a long, heavy beat of silence stretch out, just long enough to make him notice. I was about to speak. But then, the front door opened. Captain David Walker entered, just as he always did, shoulders back, eyes sweeping the room. He had that situational awareness you can't teach. He was older, grayer at the temples than when I'd last seen him, but he carried himself with the same unshakable calm. The same calm that had kept our squadron alive over the Persian Gulf when I was 27 and everything was on fire. He stopped mid-stride. His eyes found me. His entire posture shifted, not relaxed, but sharp, formal. He came to attention. He saluted. "Good to have you back, Phoenix 1," he said. His voice cut across the room like a blade. The silence that followed had weight. I returned the salute, crisp and deliberate, exactly how he'd taught me a decade ago when I was a nugget pilot who couldn't land on a carrier deck in a crosswind. Every man in that room was frozen. The lieutenant who'd called me sweetheart had taken 2 steps back, his face cycling through confusion, then dawning recognition, then something close to panic. "Good to be back, sir," I replied. Captain Walker moved to the podium, queuing up his slides. "Gentlemen," he began, and I noticed he didn't even look at them. "Let me introduce Commander Elise Rogers." He paused, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. "Some of you may know her call sign, Phoenix 1. She earned it during Operation Enduring Freedom after her F/A-18 took battle damage over Kandahar. Hydraulic failure, electrical fire, and she still put her ordnance on target before recovering to the carrier." The room was absolutely still. She later commanded VFA 41, the Black Aces, through 2 deployments. She holds the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with Valor device. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces. She's here as a candidate evaluator for this selection cycle. His voice hardened just a fraction. And she's senior to every person in this room, except me. I watched their faces. Some tried to hide their shock, their embarrassment. Others didn't even bother. The lieutenant, his name Cruz, had gone absolutely pale. Another, younger pilot, red hair, freckles, stared intently at his boots. A third, near the front, met my eyes for half a second before quickly looking away. I understood exactly what was happening in their heads. They were recalculating, running through everything they'd said in the last 20 minutes, wondering if I'd heard, wondering what it would cost them. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not vindication, not even satisfaction. Just a tired, familiar weight. Captain Walker started the briefing, technical and focused, the usual rundown of training objectives for Top Gun. I took notes, asked 2 clarifying questions, and remained silent otherwise. When he dismissed the group, the pilots filed out in a hushed, almost reverent silence. Cruz lingered by the door, clearly wanting to say something, but I didn't give him an opening. I gathered my materials and walked to the front. "You didn't have to do that," I told Walker once we were alone. The introduction. "Do what?" he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "They would have figured it out eventually." "Eventually isn't the same as immediately," he countered. "Besides, you've outflown most of the instructors here. They needed to know." "I don't need you to fight my battles, David." "I'm not fighting your battles," he said, closing his laptop. His eyes were serious now. "I'm preventing a bunch of junior officers from ending their careers before they even start. You've been gone 3 years. Things haven't changed as much as they should have." He was right. I hadn't argued. Being overseas, flying missions where rank trumped gender because everyone was too tired to care about anything but survival, coming back stateside was like stepping backward in time. "How long are you here?" he asked. 6 months, maybe longer. Depends on the next assignment. "You thinking about staying in past 20? "I don't know yet," I admitted, picking up my empty coffee cup. "Depends on whether I still like the job when I'm not dodging surface-to-air missiles." He let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Fair enough. Listen, Rogers. I'm glad you're here. We need people like you in the schoolhouse. People who've actually done the job under fire." "You mean women?" I challenged gently. "I mean pilots. Who know what the hell they're doing and can teach these kids how not to die." He paused, considering. "But yeah, women too. It matters that they see you here, whether they know it yet or not." I left the building 20 minutes later, walking across the base toward the bachelor officers' quarters. The sun was lower now, the air still hot but losing its bite. I passed the flight line, rows of F divided by a -18s, wings folded, canopies glinting. Half my life had been spent in jets like those, strapped into an ejection seat, the ocean 5 miles below. It was the only place I'd ever felt completely sure of myself, completely free of doubt. On the ground, everything was complicated. In the air, it was simple: fly the aircraft, complete the mission, bring everyone home. I thought about Cruz and his stupid Secretaries sit outside comment. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not vindication, not even satisfaction. Just a kind of tired familiarity. I'd heard versions of that line 100 times over the years. You get used to it or you don't. And if you don't, you leave. I'd stayed because I was good at the job. And because leaving would have meant letting people like him win by default. But some days I wondered what it would have been like to choose a career where competence was assumed instead of constantly tested. My phone buzzed. A text from Walker. "Drinks later if you want to catch up properly." I sent back a thumbs-up emoji and kept walking. The air smelled like jet fuel and dust, familiar and clean in a way that made perfect sense to me. Somewhere behind me, an aircraft engine spooled up for a test run, the sound rising and falling like breathing. I'd be back in a cockpit in 2 days for my requalification flights. Until then, I had paperwork, briefs, and a room full of young pilots who were just beginning to understand that the person they'd underestimated was about to evaluate whether they were good enough to be here at all. I joined the Navy at 19. My Marine father always said the military would give me structure, purpose, and a way to pay for college. He was right about two of those three. I started as an aviation electronics technician, E3, turning wrenches on radar systems. I was good with my hands, good with circuits, but watching those pilots walk past me on the flight deck, something in me wanted that. The freedom, the complexity, the way everyone looked at them. So I applied to officer candidate school. Took me 2 tries. The first time, they said my test scores were fine, but I lacked leadership presence. Code for something I didn't want to decode. The second time, I scored higher, ran faster, and made damned sure I was impossible to ignore. They accepted me. I was 21. Flight school was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Not because I wasn't capable. I was. But I was always half a step behind in the informal knowledge, the unspoken rules, the camaraderie that formed naturally among the men in my class. It took me extra effort to even access it. I studied twice as long, flew every extra hop, and kept my mouth shut when the jokes got uncomfortable. I earned my wings at 25, flying F/A 18 Hornets off the USS Harry S. Truman. My first cruise was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I learned how to land on a carrier deck at night in bad weather, how to refuel at 20,000 feet, how to put a bomb on target from a dive that made your vision gray at the edges. I also learned how to be the only woman in a ready room full of men who didn't quite know what to do with me. Some ignored me. Some went out of their way to help. A few made it clear they thought I didn't belong and never would. I stopped caring which category anyone fell into. I focused on being better than all of them. My call sign, Phoenix 1, came during my second deployment. Afghanistan. Close air support. One of those missions where you're on station for hours, and then everything happens in 90 seconds. I took a hit, small arms, a lucky shot, that punctured a hydraulic line and started an electrical fire. The controls went sluggish. Alarms screamed. Smoke filled the cockpit. I still had ordnance loaded, a target marked, and the forward air controller was on the radio. We need that bomb now or people are going to die. So, I put it on target, rolled in, pickled the GPU, pulled off, and flew the dying aircraft back to the carrier with one good hydraulic system and half my electrical panel dark. I trapped on the third wire, shut down the engine, and climbed out. The deck crew was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. The fire had burned through part of the cockpit paneling. Maintenance told me later, if I'd stayed airborne 10 more minutes, the flight control computer would have failed, and I'd have ejected over the ocean. Captain Walker, my CO, then called me into his stateroom that night. Poured me a bourbon, technically against regulations, but nobody was going to mention it. That was either the gutsiest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen, he said. Both, sir. I told him, a wry smile escaping. He laughed. Fair assessment. You know what a phoenix is? A bird that rises from fire? Yeah. That's you now. Phoenix 1. He raised his glass. Welcome to the fraternity, Rogers. The call sign stuck. Within a week, everyone on the ship knew the story. Half of it exaggerated, but the core was true. I became the pilot who'd flown a burning jet back to the boat and landed it like it was a routine Tuesday. The respect that followed wasn't universal, but it was real. People stopped questioning whether I could handle the job. They started asking me for advice instead. I made lieutenant commander at 32. Commanded VFA, 41, the Black Aces at 35. 2 deployments, 2 times brought everyone home alive. That's the metric that matters in naval aviation. Everything else is secondary. I earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission over Yemen, leading a strike package through heavy anti-aircraft fire. The Air Medal with Valor came from a different mission, a different war. Details I don't talk about much. Some of it's classified. Some of it, I just don't want to remember. Walker stayed in touch through it all. He made captain, got assigned to Top Gun as an instructor. When my squadron command tour ended and I was due for a new assignment, he called. Want to come to Fallon? Teach the next generation? Help shape the program? I said yes. I trusted him. I was tired of deploying, and part of me wanted to see if I could still do the job without the adrenaline. I arrived at Naval Air Station Fallon in late September. It felt different from a carrier, more permanent, less transient, but the flight lines smelled the same, sounded the same. I flew 3 hops that first week, each one sharper than the last. My hands remembered the controls, muscle memory that had never faded. It was on that second week, during that briefing in room 7, that I realized how much the job had changed and how much it hadn't. The young pilots weren't worse than the ones I'd flown with 15 years ago. They were just the same, confident, skilled, and in some cases, blind to their own assumptions. I didn't blame Cruz for what he'd said. He didn't know who I was. But I also didn't excuse it. Ignorance isn't innocence. At some point, you're responsible for what you don't know. That night, Walker and I met at a quiet bar off base. We talked about the people we used to fly with, the ones who'd stayed in, the ones who'd gotten out, the ones who hadn't made it home. He told me about his daughters. I told him about my mom. "You ever think about getting out?" Walker asked, taking a sip of his beer. "Every day," I said. "And then I go flying, and I forget why I wanted to leave." He nodded. "That's the trap, isn't it?" "Yeah." I finished my beer, setting the bottle down. "It is." The word spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, everyone on base seemed to know who I was. I walked into the operations building, and the senior chief at the desk stood up, greeting me by rank and name. In the hallway, junior officers stepped aside to let me pass, one nodding with a tight, respectful expression. On the flight line, the crew chief assigned to my aircraft, a broad-shouldered, gray-haired chief petty officer named Marcus Hale, saluted. "Honor to have you flying my bird, ma'am," he said. I stopped, surprised. "You know who I am?" "Everyone knows who you are, Commander Phoenix 1, he grinned. "We read about you in the maintenance logs from Truman. That fire you brought back? We used that as a case study for damage assessment training." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "Let's make sure this one doesn't catch fire then." He chuckled. "Roger that, ma'am." The pilots, though, were harder to read. Some avoided me entirely, changing direction in the hallway, or suddenly finding something fascinating to look at when I entered a room. Others made a point of introducing themselves, shaking my hand, welcoming me with a formality that felt almost defensive, like they were trying to prove they weren't like the others. A few, mostly the older instructors who'd been around long enough to see the culture shift slowly, treated me exactly the way they treated everyone else. That was the only reaction I actually wanted. Cruz, the sweetheart lieutenant, didn't approach me for 3 days. On the 4th, I saw him in the hangar, inspecting his aircraft before a training flight. I was walking past, helmet bag in hand, heading to my own jet, and he caught sight of me. He froze. For a second, I thought he'd pretend he hadn't seen me. Then he set down his checklist and walked over. "Commander Rogers," he said, his voice steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "I owe you an apology." I stopped walking. "Go ahead." What I said in the briefing room was out of line. "I didn't know who you were, but that's not an excuse. I made an assumption based on—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Based on things that had nothing to do with your qualifications or your presence there. It was disrespectful. Unprofessional. I'm sorry." I studied him for a moment. He met my eyes, didn't look away. That counted for something. "Apology accepted," I said. "But understand this, Lieutenant. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem was that you assumed someone didn't belong based on how they looked. That's the part you need to fix." "Yes, ma'am." "Are you a good pilot?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Yes, ma'am. I think so." "Then prove it in the air. That's where it matters." I walked away before he could respond. I didn't need his gratitude or his further apologies. I needed him to be better. Words weren't going to accomplish that. Only performance would. Our first simulator hop together happened on a Friday afternoon. Basic tactical intercept. 2 fighters against 4 adversaries, low altitude, compressed timeline. I volunteered to fly as lead. Cruz was my wingman. I didn't ask if it was intentional. I didn't care. We briefed for 30 minutes, straightforward, roles, responsibilities, communication. Cruz took notes, asked 2 good questions, stayed professional. In the simulator, he was slower than I expected. Not incompetent, his hands knew the aircraft, his radar work was solid. But he was thinking too much. Second-guessing his instincts, trying to fly perfectly instead of effectively. I called the initial merge, directed him to take the trailing bandit while I engaged the lead. He acknowledged, maneuvered, but hesitated on the trigger. By the time he fired, his target had defensive advantages. He ended up in a protracted engagement that burned fuel and time. I took my target, switched to support him, and ended up killing his bandit for him because he'd lost the initiative. We reset. Ran it again. Same result. The third time, I let him fail completely. Didn't bail him out. Just watched his simulated aircraft get shot down while I handled the other 3 bandits alone. When we debriefed, my voice was level, factual. You're overthinking, I said. You've got the skills, but you're not trusting them. You're flying like you're afraid to make a mistake. I am afraid to make a mistake, he admitted. Especially now. Especially with you. Why? He looked uncomfortable. Because of who you are. Your reputation. I don't want to look incompetent. Then stop trying not to look incompetent and start trying to be good. There's a difference. I leaned back in my chair. When you're in a merge, you don't have time to think about how you look. You have time to decide, execute, adapt. That's it. Everything else is noise. How do you turn off the noise? You don't, I said, standing up. You just get louder than it is. We're flying again on Monday. Same scenario. This time, I want you to make decisions fast and live with the consequences. I'd rather see you fail decisively than succeed hesitantly. He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. On Monday, he was better. Not perfect. He still hesitated once, still second-guessed a targeting call. But he was faster, sharper, more aggressive. When I directed him to engage, he committed fully, drove his bandit defensive, and killed him clean. We won the scenario with fuel to spare. In the debrief, I told him he'd done well, pointed out 2 mistakes, and moved on. He looked relieved, like he'd been holding his breath for 3 days. After that, something shifted. Not just with Cruz, but with the other pilots in the training program. They started asking me questions, technical ones about weapons employment, tactical ones about decision-making under pressure. In the ready room, they stopped going quiet when I walked in. On the flight line, they treated me like what I was, an experienced pilot who'd done the job and lived to teach it. I didn't soften my feedback. I didn't lower my standards or make exceptions. When someone flew poorly, I told them. When someone made a dangerous decision, I explained why it would get them killed in combat. But I also recognized good work. And I made a point of telling them when they'd done something right. Respect in aviation is earned through consistency, confidence, and fairness. You can't fake any of those things. You can't demand them. You just have to be worth following. By the end of the second month, Cruz had improved significantly. He was flying with confidence, making decisions faster, his tactical awareness sharpened. In a brief after one particularly challenging sortie, he stayed behind. "Commander," he said, his voice softer now, more genuine. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me after the way I started." "I didn't do any favors, Lieutenant," I replied honestly. "You did the work. Still, it means something." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. How do you deal with it? The people who don't take you seriously? The ones who assume you're not as good because you're different." I thought about that for a moment. "I don't deal with them," I said. "I outlast them. I outfly them. And eventually they either figure it out or they wash out. Either way, it's not my problem to solve. It's theirs." He nodded, processing that. "That sounds lonely." "It is," I agreed. "But being good at something difficult is always lonely. That's not unique to me." I picked up my notes, heading for the door. Then I stopped, turning back to him. "Cruz, you asked how I deal with people who underestimate me. Here's the real answer. I stopped caring what they think. And I started caring whether I'm right. When you're in the cockpit, Nobody's opinion matters except yours and your wingman's. Everything else is just static. Learn to tune it out. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. I left him there. I didn't need his gratitude or further apologies. I needed him to be better. Only performance would achieve that. Lieutenant Erin Moore was the only other woman in the training cycle. F/A, 18 pilot, quiet, confident. The kind of officer who did her job well, without needing recognition. We'd exchanged polite greetings, but hadn't really talked until one afternoon when she knocked on my office door. Commander, she began, sitting down. I wanted to ask your advice about how to handle something. Go ahead. There's an instructor here, I won't say who's been making comments. Nothing overtly hostile, just small things. Jokes about women pilots, suggestions that I'm only here because of diversity quotas, comments about my appearance in my flight suit. It's not constant, but it's enough that I'm always aware of it. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Have you documented it?
No.
I don't know if I should. I don't want to be the woman who can't take a joke. I don't want to make it into a bigger thing than it is. More, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Listen to me. If someone is making you uncomfortable, that's already a big thing. You're not overreacting by acknowledging it. But what if I report it and nothing happens? Or worse, what if it makes me a target? I've seen how that goes. The woman who complains gets labeled difficult, emotional, unable to handle the culture. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to promise her that if she reported it, the system would protect her, that the instructor would be held accountable, that it would all work out fairly. But I'd been in the Navy long enough to know that wasn't always true. Here's what I can tell you, I said. You have 3 options. 1. Document everything and report it through official channels. That's the right answer by the book, and sometimes it works. 2. Handle it directly. Confront the instructor. Tell him the behavior is unacceptable and make it clear that if it continues, you will report it. 3. Ignore it and focus on flying better than everyone else, which is what I did for most of my career. Which one do you recommend? She asked, her eyes searching mine. Honestly, I don't know anymore. I used to think option 3 was the only viable choice. Now, I'm not sure that was right. I survived. But I shouldn't have had to survive. None of you should. She nodded slowly. What would you do now? If I were in your position now, I'd confront him directly. I'd tell him his comments are unprofessional and unwelcome, and I'd make sure there was a witness present so it couldn't be twisted later. And if it continued, I'd document and report. But that's me, at this point in my career, with this rank and this reputation. You have to make the choice that you can live with. Thank you, ma'am, she said quietly and left. I sat there, staring at my desk, feeling the weight of a conversation I'd had versions of a dozen times over the years. The advice was sound, but it felt insufficient. The fact that she had to calculate the risk of reporting harassment, had to weigh her career against her dignity, was an indictment of a system that claimed to value integrity above all else. 2 weeks later, I heard through Walker that Moore had confronted the instructor, and the behavior had stopped. I didn't ask for details. I was just glad she'd found a path forward that worked for her. In December, we flew a large force exercise, 8 aircraft, multiple target sets, complex threat environments. I led one of the divisions, with Cruz as my wingman. The brief took 90 minutes. By the time we stepped to the aircraft, everyone knew their role. The mission went better than I expected. Cruz flew solid wing, executed every directive without hesitation. When we hit the target area and the simulated surface-to-air threats activated, he kept his composure, employed countermeasures correctly, and stayed offensive. We put all our ordnance on target, egressed clean, and recovered. In the debrief, I highlighted his performance as an example of disciplined execution under pressure. Afterward, as we were walking back to the operations building, he spoke up. Commander, can I ask you something? Sure. When you were flying combat, real combat, not training, were you ever scared? I stopped walking and looked at him. Every single time. But you didn't show it. Showing it doesn't help anyone. But yeah, I was scared. Fear is not the problem. The problem is letting it make your decisions for you.
He thought about that.
How? How do you keep it from taking over? You focus on the task. You trust your training. And you remember that your wingman is depending on you to do your job the same way you're depending on them. That's bigger than fear. Did you ever lose anyone? He asked, his voice lower. Someone you were flying with? I didn't answer right away. The question had weight. Yes, I said finally.
Twice.
Both times in combat. Both times there was nothing I could have done differently. That doesn't make it easier, but it's the truth. Do you still think about them? Every day. We walked the rest of the way in silence. When we reached the building, he stopped. Thank you for teaching me, ma'am. I know I didn't make it easy at first. You're doing fine, Cruz. Keep it up. That night, I sat in my quarters, pulling up old photos on my laptop. Pictures from deployments, from squadrons I'd served with, from missions I'd flown. Faces I hadn't thought about in months or
years.
Some were still flying, some had gotten out. 2 of them were gone. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about the cost of this job. The weight of carrying other people's lives in your hands every time you strapped into a cockpit. It never got lighter. You just got stronger. In late January, Cruz deployed with his squadron to the Western Pacific. A week after he left, I got an email from him, brief, professional, thanking me for the training. I didn't reply immediately. I wasn't good at the sentimental side of mentorship. But 2 months later, another message arrived, longer this time, sent from a ship-based email account with intermittent connectivity. Commander Rogers, I wanted to write and tell you something that happened yesterday. We were flying a mission in support of a joint exercise. Details I can't share, but it was complex, high-tempo, multiple threats. At one point, my flight lead got task saturated, started making decisions too slowly, and I had to step up and take tactical control of our section. I remembered what you told me. Make decisions fast and live with the consequences. So I did. I called the shot, repositioned our element, and we completed the objective without incident. Afterward, my flight lead thanked me, said I'd kept him from making a mistake that could have compromised the mission. And I realized that I'd finally stopped flying scared. I was flying like you taught me. Trusting my training, trusting my instincts, focusing on the task instead of worrying about how I looked doing it. I know I gave you every reason not to invest time in me after what I said at that first briefing, but you did anyway. And it made the difference between me being an adequate pilot and being a good one. So, thank you. Not just for the tactical instruction, but for showing me what it actually means to be professional. Respectfully, James Vector, Cruz. I read the email 3 times. Saved it in a folder. Closed my laptop. I didn't reply. There wasn't anything I needed to say that he didn't already understand. He'd done the work. He'd become the pilot he was capable of being. That was the only response that mattered. But I thought about that email for days afterward. Thought about the fact that he'd signed it respectfully. Thought about the call sign he'd earned, Vector. Thought about the moment he'd stepped up and taken control because someone needed him to. That was what this job was supposed to produce. Pilots who could make hard decisions under pressure and live with the consequences. Not perfect people, just competent ones who understood the stakes. Walker asked me one afternoon if I'd heard from any of the students. I mentioned Cruz's email, without going into detail. That's the part of this job people don't talk about, Walker said. You spend months teaching them, then they leave, and you never really know if it mattered until you get a message like that. Does it make up for the rest of it? I don't know, I said honestly. Does it for you? He smiled, a deep, tired smile. Ask me in 10 years. In March, I received orders for my next assignment, a staff position at the Pentagon, working on aviation readiness and training policy. It was the kind of job that meant long hours, no flying, and influence over programs that affected thousands of pilots I'd never meet. It was also the kind of job that signaled the Navy was taking me seriously as a senior officer, seeing me as someone worth investing in for higher leadership roles. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to stay at Fallon, keep teaching, keep flying. Part of me was ready for something different. Something that didn't involve strapping into an ejection seat and trusting my life to a machine. I called my mother. She was thrilled. She'd always worried about me flying, Spent years picturing worst-case scenarios every time I deployed. A desk job in Washington meant I'd be safe, stable, closer to normal. "Are you happy about it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I told her. "Ask me when I get there." I had 3 months left at Fallon. I spent them the way I'd spent the previous 6. Teaching, flying, mentoring the next group of pilots. Some knew who I was before they arrived. Others found out the same way crews had, through a moment of surprise, recalibration, and eventual respect. I stopped trying to predict which category people would fall into. It didn't matter. What mattered was whether they could fly, whether they could lead, whether they could handle the job when it stopped being theoretical and started being real. On my last day, Walker took me to lunch. The same bar, the same booth, the same food. We just talked, comfortably, about nothing important. Then he set down his beer. "You made a difference here, Elise. I know it didn't always feel like it, but you did." "I just did the job," I said. "That's exactly why it mattered. You didn't make it about proving a point. You made it about being good at what you do. And that's what they needed to see." I didn't know how to respond. I just nodded, finishing my drink. That night, I packed my belongings into my car and drove off the base for the last time. I stopped at the gate, looked back at the flight line in the rearview mirror. Rows of aircraft under floodlights, the desert sky dark and full of stars. I thought about all the hours I'd spent in planes like those. All the missions. All the people. Some were still out there, some had moved on, some were gone. I drove east through the night, headlights cutting through the darkness, the road stretching out ahead toward whatever came next. I didn't know if I'd made the right choices over the past 15 years. I didn't know if the sacrifices had been worth it.
But I knew I'd done the job, done it well,
and taught others to do the same. For now, that was enough. The Pentagon was exactly as bureaucratic and exhausting as I expected. A windowless office. Days spent in meetings about training syllabi and budget allocations. A small apartment in Arlington I barely furnished because I didn't plan to stay long. The work was important, I understood that intellectually. But it lacked the immediacy of flying, the clarity of purpose that came from strapping into a cockpit. 6 months into the Pentagon assignment, I received a message from the Chief of Naval Personnel's office. They wanted to discuss my future career path, potential command opportunities, timelines for promotion to captain. It was the kind of meeting that could determine the next 5 years of my life. I prepared for it like a check ride, reviewed my record, anticipated questions, made sure I knew what I wanted. The meeting was professional, direct. They asked if I was interested in major command, an aircraft carrier, an air wing, a significant shore installation. I said yes because saying no would effectively end my upward trajectory, and I wasn't ready to do that.
Yet.
They asked if I was willing to accept another staff tour before that. I said yes again because that was the expected answer and I understood how the system worked. Afterward, walking through the Pentagon corridors, I felt a strange sense of disconnection. Like I was moving through someone else's life. This was the path I'd chosen, or the path that had chosen me. But it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a role I was playing, a script I was following because I didn't know how to write a different one. I called Walker that night. "You ever feel like you're doing everything right, but none of it means anything anymore?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Every day," he said, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. That's why I stayed at Fallon as long as I could. Once you leave the operational world, it's all just abstractions. Important abstractions. But still. How do you deal with it? I remind myself that someone has to do this job, and it might as well be someone who actually understands what the fleet needs. That helps sometimes. Other times, I just drink bourbon and watch baseball. I laughed. The first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. "That's your professional advice?" "That's my honest advice. The professional version is, you find meaning where you can, and you trust that the work matters, even when it doesn't feel like it does." That's bleak. It's the military, Elise. We don't do this job because it's easy, or because it always feels meaningful. We do it because it has to be done. I sat with that for a while, after we hung up. He wasn't wrong. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I'd given so much to this career, Years, relationships, parts of myself I couldn't get back. And I wasn't sure what I'd gotten in return. Rank, respect, a call sign people recognized. But also loneliness, exhaustion, and a growing sense that I'd optimized my life for a mission that might never feel complete. In November, 18 months after leaving Fallon, I received a message from the Bureau of Naval Personnel. I'd been selected for Major Command, specifically, Commanding Officer of Naval Air Station Oceana, one of the largest naval air stations on the East Coast. Thousands of personnel. It was a significant assignment, positioning me for captain, potentially flag rank. I should have been excited. This was what I'd worked toward my entire career. But when I read the message, all I felt was tired. I accepted the assignment. Because that's what you did. You didn't turn down Major Command unless you were ready to retire. And I wasn't ready for that. Or maybe I was, and I just didn't know how to admit it. Before I transferred to Oceana, I took 2 weeks of leave and flew to Arizona to visit my mother. She was 70 now, still sharp, active. We spent the days hiking, cooking, talking about everything but the Navy. It was the most relaxed I'd felt in years. One evening, sitting on her back patio, watching the sunset paint the sky purple and orange, she asked me if I was happy. "I'm successful," I said. "That's not what I asked." I didn't answer right away. "I don't know, Mom. I've spent my whole life trying to be good at this job, and I am good at it. But I'm not sure that's the same thing as being happy." "Then why do you keep doing it?" "Because it's what I know. Because I've invested too much to walk away now. Because I don't know who I am if I'm not doing this." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father used to say something similar. He loved the Marines, gave them everything he had. But at the end, he wished he'd spent more time with us. Wished he'd made different choices. I don't want that for you, Elise. I want you to have a life outside of all this." "I have a life."
Do you?
Or, do you have a career that takes up all the space where a life should be? I didn't have an answer. We sat in silence, watching the stars come out, and I thought about all the things I'd sacrificed without really choosing to. Relationships. Stability. The possibility of something beyond the Navy. I told myself it was worth it, that the mission mattered more than personal comfort. But sitting there with my mother, I wasn't sure anymore. I took command of Naval Air Station Oceana in January, 2 years after leaving Fallon. The change of command ceremony was formal and precise. Speeches, salutes, the passing of the flag. I stood in front of hundreds of personnel and swore to execute the duties of my office, to lead with integrity, to uphold the standards of the U.S. Navy. Afterward, people congratulated me, shook my hand, welcomed me. I smiled, thanked them, and tried to feel something other than the crushing weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. The job was consuming. 12-hour days, sometimes longer. Managing operations, personnel, budgets, maintenance, community relations. I flew occasionally center flights, proficiency hops, but it wasn't the same. I was the commanding officer now, which meant I was always thinking about risk management, liability, appearances. The freedom I'd felt as a younger pilot, the pure joy of flight, had been replaced by caution and calculation. 6 months in, I received news. Captain David Walker had retired. I'd known it was coming. He'd hit his 30 years, told me months earlier he was done. But seeing the official message still hit me harder than I expected. He'd been a constant presence, a mentor and friend who understood this life. Now he was gone, transitioned to civilian life, and I was still here, grinding. I sent him an email, congratulating him, asking his plans. He replied a week later. He'd taken a job as a flight instructor at a civilian school in Colorado, teaching people to fly small aircraft for fun. The message was brief, but I sensed the contentment, the relief of stepping away from the bureaucracy and getting back to the simple act of flying. I was happy for him, and I was envious, in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. Then, an email arrived on a Tuesday in September, almost 3 years after I'd left Fallon. Subject: Request for guest lecture, Top Gun. I opened it curious. It was from Captain Sarah Chin, CO of Naval Fighter Weapons School. They were hosting a leadership symposium, looking for senior officers who could speak to balancing technical excellence with leadership responsibilities. They'd be honored if I'd consider participating. The event was October 15th. All travel covered. I stared at that email for a long time. Fallon. The place where I'd spent 6 months teaching, mentoring, rediscovering what I loved about this job. The place where I'd felt like I was making a tangible difference instead of shuffling paperwork and managing bureaucracy. I accepted. I arrived at Fallon 2 days before the symposium. The base looked the same. Flat desert landscape, rows of aircraft, mountains in the distance. I checked into the BOQ, spent the evening walking around, remembering what it had felt like to be here, to have a clear purpose every day. The next morning, I visited the operations building. Some staff recognized me. Others were new, treating me with polite formality. I ran into Chief Marcus Hale on the flight line. His face lit up. "Commander Rogers. Good to see you, ma'am. You here for the symposium?" "I am. How have you been, Chief?" "Can't complain. Still keeping these birds flying. Heard you're running Oceania now. That's a big job." "It is." "You miss flying every day?" He nodded. Knowingly. "That's the trade-off, isn't it? The higher you go, the further you get from the cockpit." "Yeah," I said, a sigh escaping. "It is." The symposium was held in the main auditorium. About 60 pilots, current students, recent graduates, senior instructors. I sat through the morning sessions, listening to others talk about leadership. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, looked out at the audience, and felt a strange sense of calm. This was familiar territory. Not the speaking that was always uncomfortable, but the audience. These were pilots. People who understood the job, who lived the life I'd lived. I didn't have to explain myself to them. "I'm Commander Elise Rogers," I began. "Call sign Phoenix 1.
Some of you might know that story.
Some of you might not. Either way, I'm not here to talk about my combat record. I'm here to talk about something harder. What it means to lead when you're not sure you have anything left to give." A few people sat up straighter, paying closer attention. "I've been in the Navy for 20 years, I continued. "I've flown combat missions, commanded a squadron, taught at this school, and now I run an air station. And I'm going to tell you something that nobody says at these events. Most days, I'm not sure any of it was worth it." Silence. I had their full attention now. "I'm not saying I regret my choices. I'm saying there's a cost to this career that nobody warns you about. You give everything to the mission, your time, your relationships, your sense of who you are outside of this uniform. And the mission takes it, gratefully, without hesitation. And at some point, you look up and realize you've optimized your entire life for something that will replace you the moment you're gone." I paused. Let that sit. So, why do we do it? Why do we keep showing up? Keep flying? Keep leading, even when it's hard and lonely and exhausting. I looked around the room, seeing young faces, older faces, people at every stage of their careers. Because someone has to. Because the mission matters, even if it doesn't always feel like it does. And because the people you fly with, the people you lead, they're worth it. They're worth the sacrifice, the exhaustion, the loneliness. When I was here 3 years ago, I taught a lieutenant who made a mistake, a bad one. He underestimated me, disrespected me, and he had to learn the hard way that assumptions are dangerous. But he learned. And now he's deployed, flying combat missions. And he's good at it. And that matters more than the mistake he made. That's what leadership is. Giving people the chance to be better than they were yesterday, even when they don't deserve it. I wrapped up, thanked them, and stepped down. The applause was polite, but genuine. Afterward, several pilots came up to talk, share their stories. One was a young woman, a lieutenant, who thanked me for being honest about the cost. "It helps to know I'm not the only one who feels this way sometimes," she said. "You're not," I told her. "And that's okay. Feeling it doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you're human." On my last morning at Fallon, I requested a solo flight. A simple proficiency hop. Nothing tactical. Just me and an F/A-18 and an hour of airspace. They approved it. I walked to the aircraft, did my pre-flight, climbed into the cockpit. Chief Hale was there, running final checks. "Good luck, ma'am," he said. "Thanks, Chief." I started the engines, ran through checklists, taxied to the runway. The tower cleared me. I advanced the throttles, felt the aircraft accelerate, felt the nose lift, felt the wheels leave the ground. And for the first time in months, I felt free. I climbed to 20,000 feet, leveled off, and flew lazy circles over the desert. No mission, no timeline, no pressure. Just flight. The sky was clear, visibility unlimited. For 30 minutes, I didn't think about command or responsibility or the cost of this career. I just flew. When I landed, I shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for a minute, helmet still on, hands resting on my thighs. I thought about Walker's email, his contentment. I thought about my mother's question, "Are you happy?" And I realized I didn't have a good answer. But I also realized that maybe happiness wasn't the right metric. Maybe what mattered was whether the work had meaning, whether it made a difference, whether it was worth showing up for, even on the hard days. And by that measure, I was doing okay. I climbed out, grabbed my helmet bag, and walked back to the operations building. Tomorrow, I'd fly back to Oceania. Back to the job. Back to the relentless grind of command. But today, I'd done something I loved, in a place that felt like home. And that was enough. 1 year later, I stood in front of a different briefing room. Same base. Same building. But this time, I wasn't walking in as a student or an evaluator. The nameplate beside the door read, Commander Elise Rogers, Lead Instructor, Advanced Tactics Division, Naval Fighter Weapons School. I'd submitted my resignation from command at Oceania 6 months earlier. The conversation with the detailer had been brief, professional. They'd asked if I was sure. I'd said yes. They'd asked where I wanted to go. I'd said Fallon. There had been a pause on the other end of the line. "We can make that happen." And they had. I wasn't running an air station anymore. I wasn't managing thousands of people or sitting in budget meetings. I was teaching pilots how to fly, how to fight, how to survive. It was a step backward in terms of career progression. Everyone knew that taking an instructor billet after major command meant you were off the flag, officer track. But I didn't care. I was flying 3 times a week, debriefing tactics every afternoon, going home to a small house off base where I'd finally unpacked all my boxes and hung pictures on the walls. My mother had visited last month, spent a week hiking with me, cooking dinners in my actual kitchen. She'd looked around the house, the furniture I'd chosen, the books on the shelves, the running shoes by the door, and said, "You look different." Different how? Lighter. Like you're not carrying something heavy anymore. She was right. I'd spent 20 years carrying the weight of proving myself, of being excellent, of never giving anyone a reason to doubt I belonged. And somewhere in the past year, I'd set that weight down. Not because I'd proven anything, but because I'd stopped needing to. The door opened, and the new class filed in. 22 pilots this cycle. 2 of them women. They found their seats, opened their tablets, settled into that focused quiet that preceded every brief. I recognized the energy in the room. Anticipation, confidence, the unspoken question of whether they were good enough to be here. I waited until they were all seated, then walked to the front. No introduction necessary. By now, most of them knew who I was before they arrived. Not from that first briefing 3 years ago. That story had faded into squadron lore, embellished and distorted. But from their own research, their own instructors. The reputation I'd built over 2 decades of flying. "Welcome to Advanced Tactics," I said. "I'm Commander Rogers. For the next 8 weeks, we're going to teach you how to think like an adversary, how to exploit weaknesses in defensive systems, and how to lead a strike package into contested airspace and bring everyone home." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over them. Some of you will struggle.
Some of you will fail.
That's not a threat. It's a statistical reality. This course has a 30% attrition rate, and we're not interested in lowering it. I pulled up the first slide, a tactical scenario for aircraft against a layered air defense network. "Let's start with a simple question," I continued. "You're the mission commander. Your package is 20 miles from the target, and your electronic warfare aircraft reports a radar system that wasn't in the intelligence brief. What do you do? Hands went up. I pointed to a lieutenant in the front row, sharp eyes, a call sign stitched on his flight suit. Blade. Abort the mission, ma'am. If the threat picture doesn't match the brief, we don't have valid ROE to continue. That's one answer, I said. Anyone else? A woman in the third row raised her hand. Lieutenant junior grade, looked young, couldn't be more than 26. Her name tape read, STOS. Adapt the plan, ma'am. Reroute around the threat. Compress the timeline and prosecute the target from a different axis. Better, I said. But you're still assuming the new radar is the only change. What if there are more surprises waiting? What if your intelligence was compromised from the start? Silence. They were thinking now, recalculating their assumptions. The right answer, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet, is that there is no right answer. There's only the decision you make with the information you have and the consequences you live with afterward. Mission command isn't about being perfect. It's about being decisive when perfect isn't an option. I ran them through the scenario, walked them through decision trees, showed them how to evaluate risk in real time. By the end of the hour, some looked energized, others overwhelmed. That was fine. They'd figure it out or they wouldn't. After the brief, Stowe approached me. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead. How do you know when you're making the right call? When there's no clear answer and the pressure's on and people are counting on you. I looked at her, saw myself 15 years ago, asking the same question to an instructor who'd probably felt just as uncertain about the answer. You don't, I said. You make the best call you can with what you know, and then you move forward. Second-guessing yourself in the moment gets people killed. Second-guessing yourself afterward is how you learn. But in the moment, you trust your training and you decide. She nodded slowly, processing that. Can I tell you something else? I added. The fact that you're asking that question means you're thinking like a leader. A lot of pilots never get there. They're so focused on being right that they freeze when there's no clear answer. Don't be that pilot. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. She left, and I gathered my materials. Through the window, I could see the flight line, rows of F divided by a -18s, ground crews moving between them, the mountains rising in the distance under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. I'd made the right choice coming back here. Not the smart career choice. Not the path to higher rank.
But the right choice for me.
That night, I met Walker for dinner. He'd driven down from Colorado, visiting for a reunion. We sat at the same bar, same table, ordered the same food, fell into the same comfortable rhythm. You seem good, he said after we'd covered the usual topics. I am. No regrets about leaving command. None.
None. I did that job.
It was important, but it wasn't me. This is. He smiled. I told you years ago that the best part of this job is the people you teach. Glad you figured it out. Took me long enough. We finished our drinks and said goodbye in the parking lot. He'd head back to Colorado in the morning, back to his civilian life, his simple job teaching people to fly for fun. I'd head back to base, back to the simulators and briefs and flight line. Different paths, same underlying truth. We'd both found a way to keep doing what we loved without letting it consume us. I drove home through the desert night, windows down, cool air rushing through the car. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a moment before going inside, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky. Somewhere out there, pilots I'd trained were flying missions, making decisions, leading others. Maybe they remembered what I taught them. Maybe they didn't. Either way, I'd done my part. Inside, I changed into comfortable clothes, made tea, sat on my couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. No paperwork. No urgent emails. No weight of command. Just a quiet evening in a house that finally felt like home. They used to say, real pilots only. Turns out, that's exactly what I was. And I didn't need anyone else's validation to know it anymore. What about you? Have you ever had to fight for your place, only to realize that proving yourself wasn't for them, but for you? I'd really love to hear your story in the comments below.